Historians are still debating whether Lagertha was a real person or just a figure of myth. Some believe that the character was based on a real woman, but that the stories surrounding her were exaggerated for dramatic effect. Still, the idea of a woman fighting in battle is far from impossible in Viking culture. After all, Viking women were no strangers to war. While most of them may not have been warriors themselves, they were deeply involved in the conflicts that shaped their world. Women might have helped with the logistics of raids, gathered supplies, or even spied on the enemy, and in some cases they may have fought. You see, Viking women weren't just relegated to the domestic sphere, they were active participants in their society's most important events, including warfare. And while the number of women who actively fought may have been small, they were a visible part of Viking military culture, and their roles were recorded in various sagas and chronicles. These accounts give us a glimpse of what life might have been like for a Viking woman, whether she was holding a shield on the front lines or managing a household back home. And here's where it gets even more interesting. In some rare but well-documented cases, Viking women were buried as warriors. Yes, I'm talking about the kind of burial reserved for someone who fought in battle. Archaeological digs have uncovered graves containing women's remains alongside weapons like swords, shields, and armor. Things you would typically expect to find in a male warrior's grave. But to add a twist in, some of these women's graves also contained symbols of power and leadership, like high-status jewelry and other markers of nobility. Yet, some archaeologists still argue that these women were likely outliers, exceptions rather than the rule. The presence of weapons in their graves, they suggest, might simply indicate that the women held some sort of high rank, but didn't actually participate in battle. Others believe that these women could have been shieldmaidens, actual warriors who fought in the wars and battles of their time. It's a mystery that continues to puzzle scholars. But one thing is clear, Viking women weren't just relegated to the background of history. They had agency, power, and in some cases, even fought alongside their male counterparts in battle. They may not have been the majority, but they certainly played an important part in the Viking world. As we continue our journey tonight, let's talk about the legendary shieldmaidens, those fierce female warriors of Viking lore. You've probably heard of them in stories, TV shows, or movies. But what's the truth behind these warrior women? Were they real or just part of Viking mythology to spice up the stories? First, let's lay down the basics. Shieldmaidens were women who, according to sagas, fought alongside Viking men. The term shieldmaidens suggests that they were warriors, women who took up arms and went into battle. But here's the catch. While these women are depicted as brave, sword-wielding fighters, the historical evidence for shieldmaidens is a bit thin. In fact, there are no conclusive records proving that these women actually fought in battle. So, was this just a story for the ages, or did Viking women really take part in the bloodshed and chaos of war? The sagas, those beautifully epic stories of Viking adventures, often mention shieldmaidens, but they were also full of mythical exaggerations. These women were described as noble and fearsome, with skills that matched or even surpassed their male counterparts. The most famous of these shieldmaidens is Lagertha, who we met earlier. She was known for her legendary courage and fighting prowess, leading her troops into battle. Yet, as we discussed, there's a fair bit of mystery surrounding whether she was a real person or just a figurehead for Viking warriors. Historians continue to debate this, with some arguing that Lagertha could have been a symbolic character, an idealized version of what a Viking woman should have been, rather than a reflection of reality. Now let's step into the world of the sagas a little deeper. Imagine yourself standing beside these warriors on the battlefield, the cold wind in your face and the sounds of clashing swords filling the air. You're there with Lagertha, a woman who is said to have fought alongside the men with sword and shield in hand. But how likely is it that women actually participated in these battles? Well, the truth might surprise you. While the sagas may have exaggerated the number of shield maidens, There is evidence that women did play significant roles in Viking warfare. In Viking society, women were considered equal partners with men in many aspects of life. Sure, there was a division of labor with men typically going off to fight, and women managing the household. But Viking women were by no means helpless or confined to their homes. They were often the ones left in charge when men went off on raids, managing farms, businesses, and even armies in some cases. When a Viking man went to war, his wife might have been left to defend the home, organize raids, or keep the society running smoothly. Some sagas even mention women acting as leaders, holding positions of power, and guiding warriors in times of battle. But what about the actual shield maidens? Were they simply wives, mothers, or daughters who stepped in for their men when they went off to war? That's another subject of scholarly debate. Some historians believe that there were indeed women who fought in battle, but they were likely few in number. Perhaps they were noble women, or maybe they were warriors who took up arms when needed. But the idea of an army of shield maidens leading Viking raids is probably a bit more myth than reality. Still, there are accounts of women being involved in some of the most famous Viking raids, and their roles were more than just passive observers. To add another layer to this discussion, let's talk about the mythological connection between shield maidens and the Valkyries. In Norse mythology, Valkyries were warrior women who served Odin, choosing which warriors would live and die in battle. These women were often depicted as powerful, divine beings, riding into battle and making life or death decisions. The image of the Valkyrie has always been a symbol of strength and combat prowess. Could the shield maidens have been inspired by these mythological figures? Or did the Valkyrie concept help fuel the legends of women warriors? There's a very fine line between myth and history in the Viking world, and that line is even blurrier when it comes to women warriors. The Valkyries were certainly a part of Viking culture, and the idea of women wielding swords and fighting on the front lines was a powerful symbol in Norse myth. It's easy to see how these mythical Valkyries could have been integrated into the stories of real Viking women, blending myth with history to create a more exciting narrative. The truth is, some women may have indeed fought like Valkyries, fierce and unyielding, prepared to face the violence and chaos of battle. But whether shield maidens were a real phenomenon or just an embellishment of myth, one thing remains clear. Viking women were far more involved in the world of war and conflict than we might assume. They weren't just staying home, spinning wool, or baking bread. They were a part of the larger Viking warrior culture, and their contributions to Viking society, whether in battle, politics, or everyday life, cannot be ignored. And here's something else to think about. If Viking women were so involved in warfare, it begs the question, why haven't we heard more about them? Why are their stories often overshadowed by their male counterparts? Perhaps it's because the history we've been taught has traditionally been focused on men. The conquerors, the warriors, the leaders. But now, we're starting to uncover the hidden roles women played, and it's time to shine a light on these unsung heroines. Now that we've established that Viking women might not have been sitting idle at home, let's delve deeper into the idea of women as rulers and tactical advisors. You may think of Viking men as the conquerors, but what if I told you that women weren't just left in the background? In fact, they often had a hand in shaping the very wars that their husbands, brothers, or fathers fought in. Picture this. You're in a Viking longhouse, the scent of roasted meat filling the air. Around you, the walls are covered with shields, and the sound of men strategizing fills the room. But amidst the warriors, there's a woman, calmly watching, perhaps even guiding the discussion. She isn't just there for company, she's there because her mind is just as sharp as any sword. Viking women, especially those of noble blood, often held a significant amount of power when it came to the strategic decisions of warfare. Historically, Viking women didn't just passively support their warrior husbands. In fact, they were sometimes the brains behind the operation. Norse sagas often depict women offering valuable advice during raids and battles. These women weren't just about waving swords, they were about making sure the right moves were made and that Viking raids and conquests went smoothly. Think about it. These women were often the ones keeping the home front secure while their men were off raiding, but many were also part of the decision-making process regarding where to raid, what strategies to use, and how to manage their warriors. Take, for example, the legendary Viking queen, Astrid. She was married to King Olaf, and according to some accounts, she was heavily involved in his military campaigns. In fact, she is said to have been a source of wisdom and counsel, advising her husband on matters of strategy and governance. This kind of influence wasn't unusual among high-ranking Viking women, as they often wielded significant political and military power behind the scenes. Of course, not all Viking women had such high-profile roles, but their influence was still felt. Viking society, though patriarchal in many ways, still provided women with a surprising amount of autonomy, especially in terms of property ownership and decision-making. Many Viking women owned land, controlled wealth, and even ruled over their territories when their husbands were away. When Viking men went on raids, it wasn't uncommon for their wives to manage the household, or even lead the clan in their absence. They were not mere bystanders in Viking society, they were active participants, influencing both the domestic and the political spheres. But what about the women who didn't hold noble titles? Were they just left out of the political and strategic picture? Not quite. Viking women, even those of lower status, had certain rights and privileges that were uncommon in other medieval societies. While it's true that the vast majority of Viking women were not leading armies into battle, they still played an essential role in shaping the course of Viking history. Let's pause for a second and think about the average Viking woman in her day-to-day life. You might picture her spinning wool, managing a home, and keeping an eye on the kids, but there's more to it than that. These women were integral to Viking society. They were involved in managing resources, negotiating alliances, and taking care of matters of law and order. The Viking world was a harsh, chaotic place, and women were expected to step up when needed. And let's not forget about the role of women in Viking law. Viking societies had relatively progressive laws compared to their contemporaries. Women had the right to divorce their husbands, and they could also inherit land and property. In some Viking societies, women could even testify in court and offer legal counsel. This was far from common in other parts of medieval Europe, where women were often excluded from legal and political matters. So, while Viking women might not have been leading the charge in every battle, they were certainly involved in the legal and political spheres that made Viking society function. Now, back to the question of women in battle. Did they wield weapons? Yes, some did, but probably not as many as the sagas would have us believe. The idea of a group of women warriors fighting side by side with the men in massive battles is a bit exaggerated. However, we do know that women could, and did, fight in certain circumstances. When a Viking settlement was under attack, women might have grabbed a sword or shield and joined the defense. There are stories of women taking up arms to protect their homes and even engaging in skirmishes during raids. However, these instances were probably more of the exception than the rule. But again, let's not downplay the power of women behind the scenes. Viking society was built on the backbone of strong women who managed families, lands, and resources. When men went off on their voyages or to battle, women often stepped up to ensure that the Viking way of life continued. And who knows? Some of them may have been warriors in their own right, but perhaps their battles were not as legendary as the ones we read about in the sagas. There's one more thing we should talk about before we wrap up this chapter. The Valkyries. You've probably heard of them, those mythological warrior women who chose which Viking warriors would live or die in battle. The Valkyries are a powerful symbol of female strength and autonomy in Norse mythology. But how do they relate to the real Viking women? It's easy to see how the stories of the Valkyries might have been inspired by real-life Viking women who fought and led their people. The Valkyries were, after all, portrayed as powerful figures who had the ultimate say in the fate of warriors. Perhaps in some way, they represented the strength of Viking women who played a role in their warriors' lives. Not just as wives and mothers, but as active, influential participants in their societies. By now you might be wondering, okay, so Viking women were strong, independent, and sometimes fought alongside men. But what about their lives at home? Did they just manage the household while their husbands went off to battle, or were they doing something more? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore now. How Viking women were more than just keepers of the home and hearth. In fact, many of them played pivotal roles in Viking society, even if they weren't swinging a sword. Imagine the scene. It's a cold evening in a Viking settlement, and the air is thick with the scent of burning wood. Inside the longhouse, women are gathered, preparing meals, managing resources, and ensuring that everything runs smoothly. While the men are away on raids or expeditions, it's up to the women to keep the household, and often the entire village, in working order. These women weren't just passively waiting for their husbands to return, they were actively managing every aspect of their lives. In Viking society, women had significant authority over their homes. They were in charge of the family's land, wealth, and resources, especially when their husbands were away. When a Viking warrior left for battle, it was often the wife who had to make critical decisions about the welfare of the household. This wasn't just about cooking meals and raising children. No, Viking women had to be resourceful, ensuring that their families survived the harsh northern winters and that their crops and animals were properly cared for. Many women were also skilled craftsmen, weaving clothes, crafting tools, and sometimes even making weapons. Take, for example, the housewife of a Viking nobleman. While her husband was off leading raids or engaging in politics, she would oversee the management of the estate. This might include overseeing the workers who tended the farm, ensuring that the family's wealth remained intact, and perhaps even making decisions regarding the defense of the property. These were no ordinary housewives. They were often powerful figures in their own right, and their leadership was crucial for the survival of their families and communities. But not all Viking women were relegated to domestic duties. Many were actively involved in trade and commerce. The Vikings were known for their extensive trade networks, stretching across Europe, the Middle East, and even Asia. Viking women were key players in this trade, managing markets, negotiating deals, and overseeing the family's wealth. They were often in charge of the production and sale of goods such as wool, textiles, and furs, which were vital to the Viking economy. Some women even took to the seas themselves, joining in trade missions and raiding expeditions. They weren't just staying behind, they were part of the economic backbone of Viking society. Now you might be thinking, okay, so Viking women were industrious and resourceful, but were they really equal to men in terms of rights and status? That's a tricky question. While Viking women did have some rights that other women of the time didn't have, they were still somewhat limited by the patriarchal structure of society. Women could own property, divorce their husbands, and even remarry, but they were still expected to marry and have children, and their primary roles were often centered around the household. Still, these rights were a significant departure from many other societies, where women were often seen as little more than property themselves. One of the most interesting aspects of Viking women's roles is the fact that they had the power to make decisions within the context of their own families. In Viking law, women had a voice. They could speak in court, and in some cases, they even had the right to represent their families in legal matters. The Viking sagas tell stories of women who were wise and just, who helped settle disputes and ensured that justice was served. These women were respected, not only for their ability to manage households, but also for their capacity to lead and make decisions. But it wasn't all work and no play. Viking women also enjoyed certain luxuries and freedoms that were uncommon in other societies. They could participate in feasts, join in festivals, and engage in the cultural life of their communities. These women were not just stuck in the home. They were active participants in Viking social life, and they had a significant influence on the direction of Viking culture and society. Their roles as homemakers were just one aspect of their complex and multifaceted lives. Still, the most fascinating part of all this is that Viking women, while often portrayed as caregivers and homemakers in popular media, were actually far more integral to Viking society than we might give them credit for. They were not just sitting idly by, waiting for their men to return. They were making decisions, managing resources, and ensuring that Viking society continued to function. In many ways, they were the unsung heroes of Viking culture, and without them, the Vikings may not have been able to achieve all they did. So, next time you think about Viking women, don't just picture them sitting by the hearth, spinning wool. Think of the powerful women who were managing estates, trading across continents, and leading their communities through difficult times. The Vikings may have been known for their warriors, but it was often the women who kept the wheels of society turning. And if you're wondering how these women navigated the complexities of life in the Viking Age, well, you're not alone. Many scholars are still debating how much influence these women really had, and whether they were truly as powerful and involved in their communities as the sagas suggest. The question remains, and it's one that might never be fully answered, but one thing is for sure. Viking women were far from passive figures in history. They were active, engaged, and absolutely crucial to the success of Viking society. As we continue to peel back the layers of Viking society, let's take a moment to think about Viking women and death. Now, I know we've been talking about warriors and leaders, but what happens when a Viking woman died? You might be surprised to learn that Viking burial practices were not only fascinating, but also hinted at the true power these women wielded during their lives. Imagine walking through a cold, foggy morning in a Viking settlement. The ground beneath your boots crunches with frost as you approach the burial site. It's quiet, save for the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. This is the final resting place for someone who lived a life filled with strength, wisdom, and perhaps just maybe combat. Viking burial practices were elaborate and often reflected the social status of the individual. When men died, they were often given grand funerals, accompanied by shields, weapons, and sometimes even ships to carry them into the afterlife. But women, too, were buried with a surprising level of honor. Some of them were laid to rest with weapons. Yes, weapons. Swords, shields, and even armor. This might sound strange because traditionally we think of men being the ones who fought in battle, right? But evidence suggests that some women were buried with these items as a way of acknowledging their strength and status in Viking society. For instance, the famous Oseberg ship burial, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to Viking burial customs, contained the remains of 2 women. These women, buried in a magnificent ship, were surrounded by a wealth of grave goods, including items that were clearly associated with the upper echelons of Viking society. The grave was also filled with symbolic objects, such as a cart, textiles, and even the remains of animal sacrifices. These were all things that would have been of great importance in the Viking world, suggesting that the women buried there were of significant status. Some scholars even argue that the presence of weapons in these women's graves suggests that they might have been shieldmaidens or warrior women. After all, if you were a Viking warrior, what better way to be honored than by being buried with your sword and shield? There's still some debate among archaeologists about the true meaning behind these graves, but the evidence is there. Some Viking women were not just the women behind the men, they were powerful figures in their own right. And it's not just about the weapons. Viking burial practices also reflect the idea that Viking women were regarded as important figures in their community, even in death. The Viking world was harsh, and survival was never guaranteed. So, when a woman died, her burial was a chance to honor her life, her role, and her contributions to Viking society. Women were often buried with items that reflected their skills and roles, things like textiles, cooking utensils, or household goods. But in the case of those women who were warriors or leaders, their burials were a testament to their influence and power. But this leads to another question. Why were these women's graves so often ignored or misinterpreted in the past? Well, for a long time, historians and archaeologists tended to focus primarily on the male graves, which were often more spectacular and filled with obvious signs of warrior status. Women's graves, however, were often seen as less important. The idea of a female warrior or leader was, for a long time, almost unthinkable. After all, the Vikings were supposed to be a society of male warriors, right? This view has been slowly changing over time. Archaeological discoveries like the Oseberg ship burial have forced us to rethink our understanding of Viking women. The more we learn, the more we realize that Viking women were not just wives and mothers. They were also leaders, warriors, and figures of great influence. The presence of weapons in their graves isn't just symbolic. It's a marker of their true place in Viking society. Now let's talk a little bit about the mythological connection. As we know, Norse mythology is full of powerful female figures like the Valkyries, who were believed to choose which warriors would live or die in battle. These Valkyries were seen as divine beings, chosen by Odin to serve him in the afterlife. The Valkyries are often depicted as beautiful, fierce, and powerful women who had control over life and death. Some historians suggest that the idea of the Valkyries was inspired by real Viking women who participated in battle or led their people. Perhaps these women were seen as having a divine or otherworldly power, and their stories were woven into the fabric of Viking mythology. But what does this mean for Viking women and their roles in society? Well, it suggests that the Viking world was filled with stories of powerful, divine women who were capable of feats that went beyond the ordinary. Whether these women were literal Valkyries or simply powerful figures who were honored and respected in their own right, their legacy lives on in both the mythological and historical record. So, when we think about Viking women and death, it's not just about their graves. It's about how their lives were remembered and celebrated, even after they were gone. These women weren't just left to fade into obscurity. They were honored as warriors, leaders, and figures of immense strength and influence. And their graves, filled with weapons, symbols, and treasures, are a lasting reminder of their important role in Viking society. The question, however, still remains. Were all these women really warriors? Did they fight in battle, lead raids, and make decisions that shaped the course of Viking history? Well, the debate continues, and likely will for years to come. Some argue that the evidence points to these women being leaders and warriors, while others remain skeptical. But one thing is for sure. Viking women were far more than just wives and mothers. They were central to the Viking world, and their stories, though often overlooked, are worthy of being remembered. As we drift further into the Viking world, let's take a moment to talk about the role of Viking women in Viking raids. Now, you might picture Vikings as these rugged, bearded men on long ships, raiding distant lands for treasure and glory. But here's a thought. What if I told you that some of these raids weren't just led by men? What if Viking women were an integral part of the process, too? Let's unravel this idea. You've probably heard about the raids that made the Vikings famous, their terrifying journeys across Europe, where they plundered monasteries, looted towns, and generally left a trail of destruction in their wake. And while men might have been the ones swinging the swords on the front lines, women played vital roles in the planning and execution of these raids. Imagine yourself, a Viking woman, sitting in the warmth of a longhouse, discussing tactics and strategies with your husband or father. While they might be the ones to set sail, you're there, offering valuable advice and perhaps even managing the affairs back home. Let's take a closer look at how Viking women might have been involved in these raids. While it's true that women didn't generally go on the front lines with their husbands and brothers, there's evidence to suggest that they were very much involved in the preparations. You see, Viking raids weren't just about charging into battle with weapons drawn. They required a significant amount of planning, coordination, and logistics. And women, particularly those in higher social classes, were often the ones who managed these affairs. For example, when a Viking man went on a raid, his wife or daughter might have been responsible for overseeing the supplies needed for the journey. Things like food, water, and weaponry. They might have been the ones to arrange the gathering of provisions, ensuring that the warriors would have everything they needed once they reached their destination. These women weren't just passive bystanders, they were key players in making sure that the raids went off without a hitch. And if you were a woman in Viking society, you would have been expected to be resourceful and capable, qualities that were essential for managing the logistics of a raid. In some cases, women were even involved in the physical action of the raid itself. While it's not common for women to have participated in every raid, there are a few recorded instances where Viking women were directly involved in combat. According to some sagas, women would join in the raids when their settlement was under attack, fighting alongside the men to defend their homes. These women were not just keeping the hearth warm while the men were away. They were willing to pick up a sword and shield when needed. Now, let's talk about the Valkyries again, because they play an interesting role here. The Valkyries, as you might recall, were the warrior women of Norse mythology, who chose which soldiers would live or die in battle. These powerful women were often depicted as divine beings who controlled the fate of warriors. While the Valkyries were mythological figures, it's easy to see how stories of real Viking women warriors could have been woven into the legend of the Valkyries. After all, Viking society was steeped in mythology, and stories of women taking part in the battlefields would have been seen as almost divine. So it's possible that the tales of Valkyries were inspired by real Viking women who fought in raids, protecting their people and playing crucial roles in the Viking conquest of new lands. But let's also take a moment to consider the possibility that Viking women weren't just participants in physical battles. They might have been the ones making strategic decisions about where to raid and who to target. It's easy to imagine a Viking woman, with her sharp mind and leadership abilities, advising her husband or the clan leader on which territories to conquer. Perhaps she had first-hand knowledge of the terrain, or maybe she had connections with other communities that made her invaluable in the planning of raids. It's not hard to picture a Viking woman sitting at a table, drawing maps and making crucial decisions about the direction of a raid, all while her husband prepared for battle. And while women were certainly active in the logistics and planning of Viking raids, they weren't always waiting at home for news of victory or defeat. In some instances, women were even the ones leading the charge. One famous example is the legendary Viking shieldmaiden Lagertha, who, as we've discussed earlier, is said to have fought alongside the men. In the sagas, Lagertha led her troops into battle, showing not only physical strength, but also tactical acumen. There's no definitive evidence that Lagertha existed as a historical figure, but her story speaks volumes about the way Viking women were perceived in their society. However, as we explore this idea of women participating in raids, we must also recognize that not every Viking woman was a warrior, and that's okay. Viking society had a complex social structure, and women's roles were not limited to just one sphere. While some women might have been warriors or leaders, many others were skilled farmers, traders, and craftsmen. Viking women were expected to be versatile, capable of running households, managing businesses, and providing for their families, all while also maintaining a sense of community and social structure. They were the backbone of Viking society, keeping everything running smoothly while their men were off conquering distant lands. So, next time you think about Viking raids, don't just picture the men charging into battle with axes in hand. Think of the women who made these raids possible, whether by managing resources, leading their clans, or in some cases, wielding swords themselves. Viking women were integral to the success of these raids, and without their involvement, it's hard to say if the Viking Age would have been as successful as it was. Now, as for the number of women who actively fought in raids and battles, that's still up for debate. Some historians argue that the number was likely small, and that the idea of women warriors is somewhat exaggerated. Others believe that Viking women may have been more involved in combat than we think, though perhaps not in the grand battles depicted in sagas. The truth is that we'll never know for sure, but one thing is clear. Viking women were far more than passive onlookers. They were active participants in the wars, raids, and conquests that defined the Viking Age. Now that we've explored Viking women's roles in the raids, let's take a closer look at Viking laws and how they shaped the lives of women. You might not think of Vikings as a particularly progressive society when it comes to gender equality, but you'd be surprised. Viking law was quite different from the laws of many other medieval societies, and it granted women rights and powers that were unusual for the time. Imagine yourself in a Viking town square, surrounded by the bustling of markets and the chatter of everyday life. The Viking law codes were strict, and the rules were clear, but they weren't all about warriors and kings. Women had their own set of rights within Viking society, and they were surprisingly empowered when it came to issues of property, marriage, and even divorce. Women in Viking society were granted legal independence in a way that many other women throughout medieval Europe weren't. Viking women could own property, inherit land, and manage their finances without needing permission from their husbands or fathers. Let's break it down. When a Viking woman married, she didn't just gain a husband, she gained legal standing. A married woman in Viking society had control over her own wealth and possessions. This meant that if her husband went off on a raid or passed away, she could take over the management of the property and assets. Viking women were also allowed to enter into contracts and make legal decisions, an unusual freedom for women in the medieval world. This autonomy in managing wealth and land made Viking women quite powerful, as they could control the resources that fueled Viking society. And what about divorce? Yes, Viking women had the right to divorce their husbands, something that was not commonly seen in many parts of medieval Europe. If a woman was unhappy in her marriage, she could initiate a divorce and reclaim her dowry. There's even evidence that women could take their husbands to court if they were mistreated or wronged. Viking law gave women the right to stand up for themselves legally, and they weren't afraid to use it when necessary. But what does this tell us about Viking women? Well, it shows that Viking society saw women as strong, independent individuals who had a significant role to play in both the household and society at large. They were not just passive participants in their marriages or their communities. Viking women could and did take matters into their own hands, whether in business or in matters of personal relationships. This level of autonomy and legal independence was far ahead of its time, and it suggests that Viking society may have been more egalitarian than we initially thought. Still, despite these rights, the role of women in Viking society was not without its limitations. While women could own land and initiate divorces, they were still expected to fulfill traditional roles as wives and mothers. Women were largely responsible for the household and children, even though they had the legal rights to manage their own land and businesses. While Viking women were certainly more independent than their counterparts in other parts of medieval Europe, they still lived within a society that was heavily patriarchal in many ways. Wars, raids, and conquests that defined the Viking Age. But what's fascinating is how Viking women, even within this patriarchal structure, were able to leverage their rights and powers to create meaningful lives for themselves. Whether they were managing estates while their husbands were off on raids or taking control of business dealings, these women weren't just standing by. They were active agents in shaping the course of Viking history. Take a moment and picture this. A Viking woman sitting in a longhouse, drafting a contract for a trade deal, or making a decision about how to defend her home during a raid. She is not just waiting for her husband to return, She is holding the reins of power and making sure that her family's legacy continues. Whether she's managing land, leading a household, or participating in legal matters, Viking women were far from being powerless figures. They were central to the very survival and success of their society. And while Viking laws provided some protections and rights to women, they weren't without their flaws. For example, while women could divorce, they had fewer rights when it came to custody of children. It was generally assumed that children would stay with their fathers if the parents separated. And while women could own property, they were still expected to fulfill certain domestic duties and had little power outside the home in public matters. Viking society may have been progressive for its time, but it was still rooted in traditions that saw men as the ultimate leaders and warriors. The Viking legal system, like their society, was complicated and full of contradictions. Women had rights, but these rights were limited by the overarching patriarchal structure of Viking culture. Still, these women were able to carve out significant roles for themselves within that system. They were warriors, traders, leaders, and mothers, and they wielded a degree of power that was uncommon for women in the medieval world. One of the most interesting aspects of Viking women's legal rights was their ability to negotiate marriages. A woman's marriage wasn't just about love. It was about securing alliances, property, and status. Viking marriages were often arranged, and the terms of the marriage were carefully negotiated. These women were not just passive participants in their marriages. They were active players in the negotiations, making sure that their dowries and property were protected, and that they had the power to manage their lives and assets. So, as we wrap up our discussion of Viking laws and the rights of women, it's clear that Viking women were much more than just wives and mothers. They were powerful figures in their own right, with the ability to own property, manage businesses, and even make decisions that shaped the course of Viking history. Viking society may not have been perfect in its treatment of women, but it certainly offered them more rights and opportunities than many other societies of the time. Now that we've seen how Viking women wielded power in both life and death, let's turn our attention to the legendary Viking women who made their mark on history. While Viking culture often celebrates the exploits of men, their raids, their conquests, their battles, there are a few notable women whose names have been preserved in the sagas and the historical record. These women were not mere footnotes in Viking history. They were trailblazers, leaders, and warriors in their own right. So, let's meet a few of them and see how their lives shaped the Viking world. One of the most famous women in Viking history is Lagertha, whom we've touched on before. According to the sagas, Lagertha was a fierce shield maiden who fought alongside the great Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok. But Lagertha wasn't just a character in a story. She was a symbol of the strength and courage that Viking women could possess. Though historical evidence of her existence is sparse, her legacy has endured, and she remains one of the most iconic figures of Viking lore. Some scholars argue that Lagertha was a fictional character, created to embody the idealized Viking woman warrior. Others believe that she may have been a real woman whose story was embellished over time. Regardless of her historical accuracy, Lagertha's story reflects the powerful role that women could play in Viking society, even in the most brutal and masculine of environments. But Lagertha wasn't the only woman who made a mark in Viking history. Let's talk about Astrid, another Viking queen who wielded significant power. Astrid was the wife of King Olaf, one of the most famous Viking rulers. According to historical accounts, Astrid was not just a passive royal consort. She was a key advisor to her husband, offering him counsel on matters of politics and strategy. She was known for her wisdom and her political savvy, and it's said that her advice helped Olaf secure his position as a powerful leader. Astrid wasn't just sitting in a royal chamber embroidering tapestries. She was actively involved in the governance of her kingdom. In many ways, she represented the kind of Viking woman who could not only lead a household but also help steer the course of an entire nation. Another notable Viking woman was Freydis Eiriksdottir, daughter of the famous Viking explorer Eric the Red. Freydis is one of the few women mentioned in the sagas who actively participated in a Viking exploration. In the sagas, she is portrayed as a fierce and fearless warrior who didn't hesitate to take up arms when necessary. One of the most famous tales of Freydis comes from the Vinland sagas, which describe her involvement in the Viking exploration of North America. During an expedition to Vinland, what is now Newfoundland, Freydis is said to have led a group of men in a battle against the indigenous people, fighting fiercely to defend the Viking colony. Freydis' story may be one of legend, but it speaks to the powerful role that women could play in Viking exploration and warfare. And then there's Gudrid, another woman whose story is told in the Vinland sagas. Gudrid was a woman of noble birth, known for her intelligence and leadership. She was one of the first Europeans to set foot in North America, and her journey to the New World is documented in the sagas. Gudrid was not only an explorer but also a mother and a survivor. Her story highlights the many roles that Viking women could occupy. She was a traveler, a wife, a mother, and a leader. Gudrid's journey to the New World was not without its hardships, but she endured and thrived, helping to establish the Viking presence in North America. Her story is a testament to the resilience and strength of Viking women, who often had to navigate the harsh realities of life in a dangerous and unpredictable world. These women, Lagertha, Astrid, Freydis, and Gudrid, represent just a few of the powerful figures in Viking history. While they are often overshadowed by their male counterparts, their stories are just as important in understanding the full scope of Viking society. These women weren't just passive figures who stood by while men raided and fought. They were warriors, leaders, explorers, and survivors in their own right. Their contributions to Viking culture and history cannot be overlooked, and their stories continue to inspire people today. But what about the other women who weren't as famous as Lagertha or Freydis? What about the everyday Viking women whose names never made it into the sagas, but who were just as important to their communities? These women may not have been warriors or queens, but they were the ones who kept Viking society running. They were the ones who managed the homes, raised the children, tended the farms, and traded goods. Their work was often invisible, but it was no less important than the work of the men who went off to battle. Viking women were the backbone of their society, ensuring that everything, from daily life to the survival of their people, ran smoothly. And this is where the myth and reality of Viking women often collide. For centuries, Viking women were portrayed as little more than wives and mothers, playing secondary roles in the grand drama of Viking history. But the more we learn about Viking society, the more we realize that women were just as integral to the Viking world as their male counterparts. Whether they were queens, shieldmaidens, explorers, or homemakers, Viking women had a profound impact on the Viking Age. They weren't just passive participants in their society, they were active agents who helped shape the Viking world, both in life and in death. As we continue to uncover more about Viking women, it's clear that their legacy is far more complex and powerful than we once believed. These women were not just mythological figures, they were real people who played crucial roles in one of history's most fascinating cultures. And their stories deserve to be remembered. As we continue to explore the fascinating lives of Viking women, let's turn our focus to one of the most intriguing aspects of Viking culture: the concept of honor. In many ways, Viking society revolved around the idea of honor. Their battles, their raids, and their entire way of life were steeped in it. But what about women in this society? How did honor apply to them, and what role did it play in their lives? Picture a Viking woman, standing in the midst of a lively gathering in the longhouse. The fire crackles in the hearth, and the voices of men and women fill the air as they discuss the events of the day. Among the group, there's a sense of respect and admiration for those who've earned honor through their actions, whether on the battlefield or in leadership. But what does it mean for a woman to earn honor in a society that's often focused on the feats of men? In Viking culture, honor was everything. It was tied to one's reputation, one's ability to fight and survive, and one's status in the community. Men earned honor by going on successful raids, winning battles, and proving their strength. But women, while they weren't often on the front lines of battle, they had their own ways of earning respect and honor. The Viking world was harsh, and survival was never guaranteed. Women played vital roles in ensuring that their families and communities thrived, and their efforts were seen as honorable in their own right. For example, the women who managed households while their husbands were off fighting or raiding were viewed as strong and capable leaders. They were responsible for the well-being of their children, the prosperity of their land, and the protection of their homes. Managing a Viking household was no easy feat. It required intelligence, resourcefulness, and a strong will. These women, while not warriors in the traditional sense, were certainly warriors in their own way, earning honor by maintaining the stability and success of their households. But Viking women could also earn honor through other means. As we've seen with figures like Lagertha and Freydis, women who participated in raids or led their people into battle were able to gain honor in the most direct way possible. These women were seen as equals to men, fighting side by side and demonstrating their strength and courage in the face of danger. In a society that prized bravery and valor, these women were able to prove that they were just as capable and honorable as their male counterparts. Honor also extended to Viking women in the legal realm. In Viking society, women had a surprising degree of autonomy when it came to matters of property, inheritance, and divorce. Women who managed their own land or businesses were respected for their ability to maintain control over their resources and ensure the prosperity of their families. Those who were able to negotiate favorable marriages or take their husbands to court for mistreatment were seen as clever and strong. In Viking culture, a woman's ability to navigate the legal system and maintain her status was another way she could earn honor. But what about the women who didn't fit into these traditional roles? What about the women who didn't lead armies or manage estates? What about the everyday women who lived simple lives but still played a crucial role in Viking society? These women may not have been celebrated in the sagas or given grand funerals, but they were no less honorable. They raised children, cared for the sick, traded goods, and kept the Viking world running smoothly. In their own quiet, humble way, they earned honor every day by fulfilling their duties and ensuring the survival of their families. The idea of honor in Viking society was complex and multifaceted, and it wasn't limited to just the actions of men. Women, too, could earn honor by fulfilling their roles within the community and demonstrating their strength, resilience, and wisdom. Whether through battle, leadership, or the management of their households, Viking women were central to the success of Viking society, and their contributions were honored in their own way. It's also worth noting that the concept of honor wasn't just about one's actions. It was also about one's reputation. A Viking woman's reputation was a key part of her honor, and it was something that was passed down through generations. Stories of a woman's deeds, whether in battle or in the home, were told and retold in the sagas. These stories, while often exaggerated, helped to shape the collective memory of Viking society, preserving the legacies of powerful women who earned their place in history. But honor wasn't always a clear-cut thing. There were instances when women's actions were questioned, and their honor was challenged. For example, in cases of adultery or divorce, a woman's honor could be tarnished. But even in these cases, Viking women had the legal rights to defend themselves and restore their honor. They could go to court, plead their case, and ensure that they were treated fairly. While Viking society was undoubtedly patriarchal, the legal system allowed women to stand up for their honor and seek justice when necessary. In many ways, Viking women were shaped by the same ideals of honor that governed the lives of men. Their roles may have been different, but their contributions to Viking society were just as important, and their honor was just as valuable. Whether they were warriors, leaders, or homemakers, Viking women earned their place in Viking history through their actions, their strength, and their ability to navigate the complex world around them. So, as we think about Viking women and their place in Viking society, let's remember that their honor was not something to be taken lightly. These women were not passive figures in the background. They were active participants in a world that valued strength, resilience, and respect. Whether they fought in battle, managed estates, or cared for their families, Viking women earned their honor in their own unique way, and their legacies continue to inspire us today. As we continue to dive into the lives of Viking women, let's talk about something that often gets overshadowed by the swords and raids. The fascinating roles these women played in the everyday life and culture of their Viking communities. Sure, we've heard about their participation in battle, the honor they earned, and the legacies they left behind. But what about the quieter but equally important parts of their lives? How did they contribute to the culture and day-to-day functioning of Viking society? The answer, it turns out, is quite profound. Picture yourself walking through a Viking village. Maybe it's early morning and the fog has just started to lift. The longhouses are bathed in the soft light of dawn, and the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of hammering. As you stroll past the houses, you might see women working outside, tending to gardens, weaving clothes, and preparing meals. These women weren't just waiting for the men to come back from their raids. They were actively shaping the culture, economy, and community life of their people. One of the most important contributions of Viking women was in the realm of agriculture. While Viking men were off fighting or raiding, it was often the women who took care of the land and the animals. Farming in the harsh Nordic climate wasn't easy, but Viking women were up to the task. They cultivated crops, raised livestock, and worked hard to ensure that their families had enough food to survive the long winters. This was no small feat. Viking women had to be incredibly resourceful, using every scrap of land and every available resource to feed their people. And it wasn't just about farming. Viking women were also responsible for making sure the household ran smoothly. They cooked meals, made clothes, and ensured that everything from the household's finances to its spiritual life was in order. The domestic work might have been physically demanding, but it was also vital to the survival of Viking society. Without these women taking care of the everyday tasks, the men couldn't have gone off to fight or explore. These women were the unsung heroes, maintaining the heart of Viking culture in the home. But Viking women weren't just involved in agriculture and domestic work. They also played an essential role in trade. The Vikings were known for their far-reaching trade networks, stretching from the British Isles to the Middle East and beyond. And women were crucial to this trading system. While Viking men were busy with raids or expeditions, women often took the lead in managing the day-to-day operations of markets and trade. They were the ones who bartered, negotiated, and managed the goods being traded. They also crafted textiles, clothing, and other goods that were valuable in trade, ensuring that Viking settlements thrived economically. Let's not forget the spiritual and cultural contributions of Viking women. In a world dominated by battle and conquest, religion and rituals played a crucial role in Viking society. And women were central to this aspect of life. Viking women were often the keepers of religious traditions, performing ceremonies, offering sacrifices, and ensuring that the gods were honored. Women could be priestesses responsible for overseeing rituals and communicating with the divine. The sagas even tell stories of powerful female figures who acted as intermediaries between the gods and the people, ensuring the prosperity and well-being of their communities. In Viking mythology, goddesses like Freya, Frigg, and Skadi were revered as powerful and influential figures. These goddesses were not just passive symbols. They were active participants in the Viking world, shaping everything from fertility to war. The reverence for these goddesses reflected the respect Viking society had for the power of women, both in the mythological realm and in the real world. Women weren't just seen as the nurturers of the home. They were also linked to the divine, and their power was acknowledged in both the spiritual and physical realms. Viking women's roles in the community weren't just limited to the domestic sphere. In fact, their cultural contributions were so significant that they helped define the very fabric of Viking society. These women didn't just sit idly by. They were leaders, strategists, and caretakers who shaped the Vikings' way of life. From managing households to participating in religious ceremonies to running businesses and trading networks, Viking women were central to the functioning of their world. But despite these important roles, many Viking women have been overlooked in the historical record. The sagas often focus on the feats of men, warriors, kings, and explorers, and women's contributions have been relegated to the background. This isn't to say that Viking women weren't celebrated. On the contrary, their roles were highly valued within their communities. But over time, the male-dominated narrative of Viking history has overshadowed the stories of women. Yet, as modern historians and archaeologists continue to uncover new evidence, it's becoming increasingly clear that Viking women were far more involved in shaping their world than we ever gave them credit for. Perhaps the most telling example of this is the archaeological discovery of Viking women's graves. In many of these graves, women were buried with items that indicated their roles in Viking society. Things like keys to homes, which were symbols of authority and responsibility, jewelry, signifying wealth and status, and even weapons, suggesting that they might have been warriors or shield maidens. These discoveries show that Viking women were far more than just homemakers. They were influential figures who helped shape the Viking world in ways we've only begun to understand. It's easy to imagine Viking women as being relegated to secondary roles in a world dominated by men, but the truth is much more complex. These women were integral to the survival and success of their society, and their contributions were invaluable. They were the ones who kept the hearths burning, the ones who tended to the land, and the ones who managed the finances. But they were also warriors, traders, leaders, and spiritual figures. Women who played pivotal roles in the larger story of the Viking Age. So, as we look back on the history of Viking women, let's remember that they weren't just bystanders in a male-dominated world. They were active participants who shaped the very fabric of Viking society. Whether they were managing the household, leading raids, or offering counsel to kings, Viking women were far more than the myths suggest. They were warriors in their own right, and their legacy is one that deserves to be remembered. As we move forward in our exploration of Viking women, let's dive into a topic that often gets overlooked in most history books: the lives of women in Viking settlements. We've talked about their roles in battle, their involvement in trade, and their contributions to Viking culture. But what about their daily lives? What did it really mean to be a woman in a Viking village? And how did these women navigate the challenges of living in such a harsh and often unpredictable world? Imagine yourself waking up early in the morning, the chill of the northern air seeping into your bones. You're in a Viking settlement, somewhere in Scandinavia, and the world around you is rugged and wild. The longhouses are dark, but there's a faint warmth coming from the fire. You rise, ready to begin the day, knowing that there's a lot of work to be done. There's no time to waste. Viking life was never easy, and every day presented new challenges. In Viking society, women were primarily responsible for managing the household. This meant that they had to keep track of everything, from the food supplies to the livestock to the well-being of their children. Women would spend much of their time milking cows, making cheese, baking bread, and weaving wool into clothing. While these tasks might sound mundane, they were critical to the survival of Viking families. Without the work of these women, the men wouldn't have been able to go off on raids or trade expeditions. They wouldn't have had the provisions or resources they needed to succeed. But Viking women didn't just care for the household. They were also responsible for preserving the culture. In many ways, Viking women were the keepers of tradition. They were the ones who passed down knowledge, stories, and skills to the next generation. The sagas, those great tales of Viking heroism, were often told and retold in the longhouses, and women played a crucial role in preserving these oral traditions. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were a way of teaching young people about their heritage, values, and the Viking way of life. Women helped shape the cultural identity of the Viking world, even if they weren't the ones fighting on the front lines. In addition to their domestic roles, Viking women also participated in various craft work and production. Weaving, spinning, and dyeing were essential skills for women in Viking society. They made the clothing that would protect their families from the harsh northern climate, and they produced textiles that were traded far and wide. Viking women were also skilled in making tools, pottery, and other items necessary for daily life. The products they created were not only essential for survival, they were also part of the vibrant trade networks that connected the Vikings to the rest of the world. One of the most intriguing aspects of Viking women's daily lives was their involvement in the spiritual and religious life of their communities. In Viking society, religion was deeply intertwined with daily life, and women were key figures in the practice of Viking spirituality. Women often took part in rituals, ceremonies, and sacrifices, playing an important role in ensuring that the gods were honored and that the community was protected. Some women even acted as priestesses, leading religious ceremonies and offering guidance to their communities. Viking women were also known to have held spiritual knowledge and wisdom. They were often seen as the keepers of magic, known as Seidr, a form of Norse sorcery that involved communicating with the gods and influencing the future. The most famous practitioner of Seidr was the goddess Freya, but Viking women also practiced this magical art. In fact, many Viking women were believed to have had special powers of foresight and prophecy, and they were often consulted by men who sought guidance on important matters, such as the outcome of a battle or the success of a raid. These women were respected for their wisdom and their ability to shape the fate of the Viking world through their knowledge of magic and the divine. But let's not romanticize Viking life too much. Life in a Viking settlement was hard, and survival was never guaranteed. The winters were long, and food was often scarce. The threat of attack was always looming, and Viking women had to be prepared to defend their homes if necessary. While Viking men were off on raids, women were often left behind to manage the household and protect their families. In times of war, women might have had to take up arms themselves to defend their homes. Even if they didn't fight in battle, they had to be ready for anything. Life in a Viking village was unpredictable, and the women who lived there had to be strong and resourceful to ensure their family's survival. Viking women also had to contend with the challenges of marriage and family life. Marriage was often a political arrangement, meant to secure alliances and increase wealth. While Viking women could own property and initiate divorce, they were still expected to marry, bear children, and maintain the family unit. The responsibilities of motherhood were heavy, and women were expected to raise strong children who could contribute to the Viking way of life. The pressures of raising children in such a harsh environment were immense, and Viking women had to be tough to ensure that their children grew up capable of surviving in the unforgiving world of the Vikings. Despite these challenges, Viking women were highly regarded within their communities. They were seen as strong, capable, and resilient. They were the ones who kept the wheels of society turning, whether by managing the household, leading religious rituals, or ensuring that the next generation was prepared to face the challenges of Viking life. The role of women in Viking society may have been overlooked for centuries, but as we continue to learn more about their lives, it's clear that these women were far more than just wives and mothers. They were the backbone of Viking society, and without them, the Viking Age might have looked very different. So, as we wrap up our look into the daily lives of Viking women, Let's remember that they weren't just the unsung heroes of the home. They were central figures in the Viking world, strong, capable, and ready to face whatever challenges came their way. Their contributions to Viking society were immense, and their legacies continue to inspire us today. Now that we've explored the everyday life and vital contributions of Viking women, let's take a moment to reflect on a particularly unique aspect of Viking culture: the role of women in the formation of Viking settlements and their relationships with neighboring cultures. Vikings weren't just warriors and raiders, they were also colonizers, traders, and settlers. And Viking women played a pivotal role in this expansion. From Iceland to Greenland and even the shores of North America, Viking women helped shape the places they called home, navigating the complexities of diplomacy, trade, and survival in unfamiliar lands. Imagine yourself in the newly established Viking colony in Iceland. The landscape is harsh, filled with volcanic rocks, wild landscapes, and a climate that's not exactly forgiving. You're part of a small community of settlers, tasked with creating a sustainable life in a land that's foreign to you. While the men are busy with the heavy lifting, literally and figuratively, there's a woman like you, walking through the settlement, organizing, keeping everything in order. You're making sure the homes are built, the animals are taken care of, and the crops are planted. Without you, this colony wouldn't stand a chance. This scene is very much the reality that Viking women faced as their people expanded across the North Atlantic. Viking colonization was often the result of necessity. As Viking warriors raided new lands, they also began to settle in these places, establishing new homes and communities. And while the men were out leading the raids or navigating the seas, the women were the ones holding down the fort. They took on crucial roles in the establishment of new settlements, ensuring that the families had everything they needed to survive and thrive. Take the settlement of Greenland, for example. The Vikings, led by Eric the Red, established a colony there in the late 10th century. But while the men were focused on establishing their claims and defending the land from outside forces, the women were tasked with a wide range of essential activities. From managing the household to overseeing livestock, Viking women played an indispensable part in the day-to-day functioning of these new communities. They were also crucial in maintaining the relationships with local Inuit populations and other groups, acting as intermediaries and fostering peaceful trade and communication. Viking women didn't just help create new settlements. They were also deeply involved in forging relationships with the peoples they encountered. This is especially evident in the case of the Viking expeditions to North America. We know from the sagas that Vikings traveled to what is now Newfoundland, where they interacted with the indigenous peoples of the region. While much of the sagas focus on the men's interactions with these groups, it's likely that women also played a part in these exchanges. Women might have been involved in negotiations, trade, or even establishing peaceful relationships. After all, Viking women were often skilled negotiators and communicators, and these qualities would have been vital when dealing with new and unfamiliar peoples. In fact, Viking women in these newly established colonies often found themselves acting as diplomats and traders, establishing relationships with the native populations in ways that helped ensure the survival of the colonies. These women didn't just wait for things to happen. They took charge, establishing relationships and securing resources that were critical to the settlers' survival. The importance of women in Viking settlements goes beyond survival, though. In many ways, they helped to shape the culture and social structure of these new Viking communities. Women were the ones who managed the homes, raised children, and taught the next generation about their Viking heritage. They passed down stories, traditions, and skills, ensuring that the culture of their people was preserved. They weren't just caretakers of the home, they were the keepers of Viking culture, transmitting it from one generation to the next. In a world that was often harsh and unpredictable, Viking women were crucial to the establishment and success of Viking settlements. Their roles were diverse and vital, from managing daily life to establishing trade and diplomatic relations. They helped create communities that lasted for centuries and laid the foundation for future generations of Vikings. Now, let's think about the Viking women who weren't part of these expansive settlements, but were instead deeply embedded in the heart of Viking society. They were the women who lived in established towns and villages, the ones who interacted daily with their communities. These women were just as integral to the success of Viking culture. They were the ones who ensured that their people didn't just survive, they thrived. Their roles might not have been as outwardly dramatic as those of the women who led raids or settled new lands, but they were just as important. They kept the wheels of Viking society turning, often quietly but with great strength. Their work might not have made the sagas, but their contributions were no less significant. Women were the backbone of Viking daily life, and their resilience, resourcefulness, and dedication were essential to the survival and success of the Viking people. So, the next time you think about Viking women, don't just picture them at home, waiting for their men to return from battle. Think about the women who created new communities in distant lands, who negotiated with foreign cultures, and who ensured the survival of their people in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Viking women weren't just part of the background, they were the heart of Viking society. And without them, the Viking Age would have been a very different place. As we move on, let's take a step back and consider one of the most enduring myths surrounding Viking women, the idea of the shieldmaiden. This concept, which has captivated the imagination for centuries, often conjures an image of fierce women warriors, fighting valiantly beside their male counterparts. But what's the truth behind this myth? Did Viking women actually fight in battle, or has the shieldmaiden idea been romanticized by history? Imagine this. The sun is setting over a vast battlefield, the clash of weapons filling the air. Among the men, there stands a woman, her armor gleaming, her shield raised high. She is a warrior, a shield maiden, and she is fighting for her people. This image, which we so often associate with Viking women, comes from centuries of storytelling, sagas, and modern depictions of Viking culture. But the question is, how much of this is grounded in reality? The term shield maiden is rooted in the sagas, those epic tales of Viking adventures where women like Lagertha and others are often described as fighting alongside the men. These women were depicted as fearless warriors, often leading armies or engaging in battle themselves. The concept of the shield maiden has become iconic, but is it based on fact? Or is it purely mythological? Let's start with the historical evidence. There are certainly references in Viking sagas to women participating in battles, but the truth is a bit murkier. While we have stories of women like Lagertha who, according to the sagas, led her troops into battle, there is no definitive archaeological or historical evidence to prove that Viking women regularly fought in wars. Some scholars argue that the shield maiden idea is more symbolic than literal. It's possible that these stories were created to embody the idealized image of Viking women, strong, courageous, and capable of taking on traditionally male roles. While Viking women may have taken part in specific battles, it's likely that the number of women who actively fought was small and not the norm. However, the lack of concrete evidence doesn't mean these stories were without foundation. There are cases where women may have fought in battles, particularly during times of extreme necessity. If a Viking settlement was under attack, or if the men were away, women might have been required to take up arms to defend their families. But these instances were likely the exception rather than the rule. Viking society, while more progressive than some of its contemporaries, was still a patriarchal system where men were the primary warriors. Now let's explore another important aspect of the shield maiden myth, the idea of the warrior woman. Could Viking women have been warriors in a different sense, even if they didn't regularly fight on the front lines? The answer is yes in many ways. While they may not have participated in every battle, Viking women held significant roles in the defense of their communities. They were skilled in the arts of combat, and many of them would have been trained in the use of weapons. In times of war, they would have been called upon to protect their homes and families. Whether it was wielding a spear to defend a village or using a sword to protect a settlement, Viking women were certainly capable of fighting if the need arose. But the most significant aspect of the shield maiden myth might be what it tells us about Viking women's potential for power and agency. The idea of a woman warrior, capable of leading men into battle, speaks to the broader societal respect that Viking women held. They were more than just wives and mothers. They were active participants in their communities and were not afraid to step up when needed. The shield maiden, whether real or imagined, symbolizes the strength, courage, and independence that Viking women were known for. Even if the actual number of shield maidens was limited, the myth of the shield maiden itself speaks volumes about how Viking women were viewed in their society. These women were not mere bystanders. They were capable, fierce, and respected members of their culture. And while the shield maiden might have been a rare phenomenon, the idea that women could fight and lead was not as far-fetched as it might seem in other societies of the time. In fact, the idea of women warriors wasn't exclusive to the Vikings. Across many cultures, from the Amazons of Greek mythology to the female warriors of the Mongols, there are countless stories of women taking up arms and fighting alongside men. The shield maiden myth is just one piece of this larger cultural narrative that celebrates women's strength and resilience in the face of adversity. So, whether or not Viking women were regularly fighting in battle, it's clear that they were far more than just passive figures in Viking society. They held power, they wielded influence, and they were capable of great feats. The myth of the shield maiden, though likely exaggerated, is rooted in the reality of Viking women's strength and ability. They were not defined by their gender, but by their actions and their contributions to their communities. The legacy of the shield maiden lives on today, not just in the pages of Viking sagas or in modern depictions of Viking culture, but in the very real achievements of women throughout history. Viking women may not have been warriors in the traditional sense, but their strength, leadership, and courage are worth celebrating. As we close the chapter on the shield maiden myth, it's important to remember that Viking women were far more complex than we often give them credit for. Whether they were leading raids, managing households, or holding political power, they were active agents in the Viking world. And even if they didn't always carry swords into battle, they fought fiercely in their own way, ensuring the survival and success of Viking society. Now that we've unraveled the layers of Viking women's involvement in society, let's take a moment to reflect on something a bit more mysterious and elusive: the spiritual and magical roles that Viking women often held. While Viking men are celebrated as fierce warriors, the women in their society weren't just shaping their communities with their physical strength and political prowess. They were also involved in the more mystical, spiritual side of Viking life. Some Viking women were believed to possess magical powers, and their connection to the supernatural was an integral part of their influence in Viking society. Imagine a quiet, foggy morning as the world around you stirs to life. You're standing in a Viking village, but something feels different today. The air is thick with a strange energy. Perhaps it's the scent of herbs burning in a cauldron, or the faint sounds of chanting coming from the nearby forest. You feel it in the air. Viking women, as much as they were warriors or farmers, were often tied to the magical and spiritual practices that permeated their world. Viking women were often associated with Seder, a type of Norse magic or sorcery. This practice involved communing with the gods, foreseeing the future and influencing the fate of individuals or communities. Seder was not something just anyone could practice. It was often passed down through generations, and it was typically practiced by women who were regarded as the spiritual leaders in Viking society. While the men were off raiding, the women held a different kind of power, one that dealt with the unseen forces of the world. The most famous practitioner of Seder in Norse mythology is the goddess Freya. She was not only the goddess of love and beauty, but also the goddess of war and magic. She was said to have the power to see the future and shape the destinies of men. Freya's magical abilities were a significant part of her appeal, and her association with Satyr is well documented in the sagas. It's easy to see how Freya, as a powerful and independent female figure, became a role model for Viking women who practiced magic. Many women in Viking society, especially those of higher status, were believed to have the ability to wield Satyr, and their skills in divination and prophecy made them powerful figures in their communities. But it wasn't just about Satyr. Viking women were also involved in other forms of magic and spiritual practices. Some women were believed to have the ability to curse or bless people, and they were often consulted for advice or to perform rituals during times of crisis. These women were seen as holding sway over the spiritual and magical forces that governed the world, and their knowledge was highly valued. When someone in the community needed guidance or healing, it was often these women who were sought out for their wisdom. Interestingly, Satyr wasn't always viewed positively in Viking society. In fact, there was a certain amount of stigma attached to the practice. Satyr was considered a feminine practice, and Viking men who practiced it were sometimes looked down upon as weaker or less masculine. The act of losing control during a trance-like state was associated with femininity and was sometimes seen as dishonorable for men. This might explain why Satyr was primarily practiced by women who were not bound by the same societal expectations of masculinity. These women, who were not afraid to embrace their connection to the mystical, held a special place in Viking culture, though their practices could sometimes be misunderstood or even feared. So, what did it mean for Viking women to be involved in these magical and spiritual practices? Well, it meant that they were more than just warriors, queens, or homemakers. They were spiritual leaders, healers, and diviners who helped guide their communities through some of the most difficult and uncertain times. Their influence extended beyond the physical world and into the realm of fate, destiny, and the divine. They were seen as protectors, not just of their families and lands, but of the very spiritual well-being of their people. And let's not forget that this spiritual role wasn't limited to the high-ranking women of Viking society. Even women in more modest positions could wield Satyr and other forms of magic. Some women were known to perform rituals and magic for everyday concerns, everything from ensuring good harvest to casting love spells. In this way, Viking women were deeply connected to the spiritual fabric of their society, and their influence extended into the lives of every Viking, from the kings to the commoners. But here's where things get a little more interesting. Satyr was not just about predicting the future or performing rituals, it was also about control. Women who practiced Satyr were often seen as having the power to influence the fates of individuals or even entire communities. If you wanted to ensure a successful raid or a good harvest, you might consult one of these women, seeking her guidance or a blessing. In times of war, the ability to foresee the outcome of a battle or the fate of a leader could be a powerful tool. Viking women, through their connection to the mystical, held the keys to the future in their hands. Of course, not all Viking women were involved in Satyr or magic. Most women focused on more traditional roles, managing households, raising children, and tending to the land. But the women who practiced Satyr or other forms of magic were regarded with great respect. They were seen as having a unique power, one that transcended the physical realm and reached into the very heart of Viking society. And this brings us back to the idea of Viking women as a powerful force in their own right. Whether they were warriors, queens, mothers, or magicians, these women played an integral role in Viking culture. They weren't just followers, they were leaders, visionaries, and spiritual guides. The mystical and magical practices they engaged in weren't just a form of entertainment or superstition. They were a vital part of the Viking worldview, helping shape the destiny of their people. As we move forward, it's clear that Viking women were far more than mere bystanders in their society. They were powerful figures connected to the divine, the mystical, and the physical worlds in ways that shaped the course of Viking history. Their strength, resilience, and spiritual insight were as much a part of Viking life as the warriors on the front lines. The legacies of these women, whether as shield maidens, traders, or spiritual leaders, are worth remembering as we continue to uncover the true stories of the Viking world.